Okay, we're going to get started here today. So we're talking today about the new hiring rules for 2022. I talked about the Great Resignation, or that's a term that people are using. I know a lot of people are trying to hire, so this seems like a really timely event. And Josh, I really appreciate you joining us for that. So we've got a little bit of administrative things to go through, and then we'll jump right into our topic around new hiring rules for 2022. I am Tom Waddleton. So I work for Summit CPA Group as one of our virtual CFOs. I'm actually part of our hiring process and trying to hire new people coming in, and I facilitate the webinars that we do. Live in Indiana. Summit is a completely remote company, and so we are spread all over the country, but that's where my home is. So a little bit of housekeeping. So today is a one CPE credit offer for the session. You do need to attend all 50 minutes. I'm going to present 3 different poll questions. I'll let people know, but you will need to answer all of those. If you've met those 2 requirements, then you will get a CPE certificate emailed to you. You'll also get the slides, a replay, email, all that stuff will be sent out by tomorrow. I will emphasize that we have the question function. That's the main way that you can interact with us. So I'll be monitoring during those sessions. I'll try to get as many of those onto Josh as I can during the session so that we can get those answered. We're also trying to leave just a little bit of time at the end for that. But in previous sessions, we've gotten a lot of questions in, which is great. Tries to make it as interactive as we can using this format. I mentioned I work for Summit CPA Group. You'll see in a second that Josh works with us as well. So just a little bit about our firm. So the firm was started in 2002, and since 2004, we've been providing CFO and back office services to our clients. In 2013, we went fully distributed. So no more office, all employees working remotely. Very common now, but at the time that was a fairly unique thing. That gave us a lot of flexibility also with where our clients are located, and then of course for hiring employees. Currently I have 55 employees, mostly in the US, 20 some states I think that we're located in, and then we've got at least 1 employee outside the US and some contractors outside the US. Josh joined our team several months ago as our people operations strategist, and really leads our hiring process and has been very knowledgeable in helping us in doing that. So Josh, welcome, and we'd love to hear more about the new rules for hiring.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. Like Tom mentioned, I'm the People Operations Strategist here at Summit. I also am living in Nashville, Tennessee with my wife and 2 little pups, and we've got a baby on the way. So I love that band that we picked for the beginning, and they're kind of weird, which is pretty true of Nashville in general, but they were all over the city, and that was a lot of fun. So I kind of wanted to rewind a little bit and reflect on what was hiring like before COVID. And some of you probably reflect on this really longingly as you think about what it was like to bring in talent before this pandemic started. We're about to enter our 3rd year of all the differences that this has brought to the hiring market, to the labor market. But if we reflect back to BC, you may remember that the job market was much more competitive from the employee standpoint. So what that means is, in general, we were getting a lot more interest from candidates in each open position that we put out into the market. So we were getting more attention, both in the quantity of candidates, and also we were having a higher number of qualified candidates apply for different open positions. The market before COVID started also allowed hiring teams to be a little bit slower in their response, and they could be more meticulous as they went through the process of reviewing resumes. And we saw people stretching timelines to be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even between their first or their second interview. And as many of you probably know, that's not a reality right now. If you interview somebody and you don't try and reach out to them for a second interview for 3 weeks, they are long gone. They've got 2 job offers at other places and you've missed the boat with them. But back in 2019 and earlier, really we saw that the hiring process, we had the ability to do it quicker, but it didn't have to be faster because candidates didn't have as many options available to them, and the options that they were pursuing weren't moving as quickly to hire them. So pardon me, we were able to stay competitive even on a slower timeline. And that's really shifted as we've come into this new reality that we've experienced kind of over the last 23 months and is continuing to go. So I kind of want to walk through an illustration that's really helped me think about hiring in this environment. And I'll give the caveat that my parents are both in real estate. They've been in real estate for 30 years, from being realtors to flipping houses to being a broker leading an office. And they made me get my real estate license when I turned 18. It was like a rite of passage. So
Our kids do this, huh?
yeah.
So Josh, I'll go ahead and launch the polling question as you, right after you kind of introduce the slide.
Yeah, so I'm going to go into how is hiring today. I debated between saying after COVID or during COVID, so I think we landed on ACDC, like both after and during. How is the hiring market right now similar to the real estate market? So as many of you probably know, if you've tried to purchase a home in the last 2 years, or if you have loved ones who've tried to purchase a home, or neighbors who've sold their house before it even went on the market, we have a huge seller's market right now. It's really hard to find real estate. It's really hard to buy a home for less than it was put on the market at. The average home right now in Nashville is on the market for 3 days. Wow. And it averages 4.5 offers on it. So I've got a couple of good friends in the city who are real estate agents, and sometimes that makes their life really easy when they're a seller's agent and really hard when they're a buyer's agent. Yeah. But the reality is we're in a position where it's really hard for buyers right now, and they're making, my best friend and his wife are trying to buy a house right now, and they've made 6 really competitive offers all over asking price and still haven't gotten one accepted. And
well, you really risk doing something dumb if you've done 5 or 6, right?
Yes,
say,
you really do.
I'm
and there's
get
been a couple that I'm
house.
like, hey, this is in like a super floodplain. Are you sure about this?
Yeah.
But
so just let people know I'm going to close the poll here in about 10 seconds. So there's a few people who haven't voted, and make sure you get your thing in. Okay, sorry, Josh, go ahead.
Just looking for kind of a status update from you guys on where you are in hiring. But today in our job market, we're seeing that we're really in an employee market. So before COVID, we really found ourselves more in what I would refer to as an employer market, or to compare to real estate, that was a buyer's market, where it was a lot more competitive on our end as the hiring teams trying to, to flip that. It's more competitive now on our end as a hiring team because we're fighting for the attention of fewer candidates in the market. And before COVID, we weren't having to fight for that attention. We were getting more applicants naturally coming to our door, and people frankly had fewer options before COVID. But because of the Great Resignation, some people have called it the Great Reshuffle. There's so many opportunities, both in wage growth and in career advancement for people, that it's really flipped. So similarly to how it's really difficult for buyers to find a house that they can snag right now, it's really difficult for hiring teams to find the right candidate. And you run some of the same risks that my best friend and his wife are running. Like, they don't want to super overpay for a house that's not actually going to give them what they wanted, and it's not going to meet the specifications of, their needs of working from home and growing a family and having pets or whatnot. We run the same risk as employers of getting desperate in the market and overpaying for talent that's not going to be able to do the job that we need them to do. Yeah. So we've got to, this is something that I want to walk into over the course of the next, 45 minutes or so, to make sure that we're not going crazy because the housing market is so unstable, but because this employment market is so erratic right now. We still want to make sure that we're making wise decisions when it comes to what candidates we're pursuing, how we're choosing to compensate them, how we're choosing to recruit them and entice them to take the offer to work with our firms moving forward.
Yeah. So Josh, the result, this looks perfect then for this audience. If I'm sharing the result, looks, as I read this, so you got 55% that are either saying I can't find qualified candidates, or I am finding them, but they're not actually coming on board with me.
Yeah, and
So,
the number that really stands out to me there is 9% are hiring and having great
yes.
success. And I would say historically, hiring practice and finding success, that number has been much, much higher before COVID. We'd usually anticipate about a third of firms having pretty smooth process of hiring and
Mhm.
bringing in talent, a third being more in that middle ground. And, sometimes they're having to spend more time on talent. Sometimes it's coming pretty naturally, and then maybe a third who are struggling more and they need to really reevaluate their hiring practices. But today that we have 9% of our group here, that's really telling that in the other 91% of you are probably feeling this right now, that this is a really difficult environment to hire in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that considering that, I want to move on to talking about sustainable hiring practice. And
Mhm.
what does this mean for us and why is it important? So the first thing I want to say, I know we've got a mix of folks here, people who are involved in the hiring process, some people who maybe manage a team that's involved in your hiring process. But something that's really important here is that you don't burn out. As, as the
Mm.
person who
Mhm.
is doing the hiring, we really want to make sure to create a system and create a practice that doesn't have you burning out, because you're just spinning your wheels. And the last thing we want is for you to be spending unproductive energy trying to hire, because then you grow in exhaustion. You also start to feel defeated. It's going to make you invest less in your hiring practice, and that snowballs really quickly. So a huge part of having a healthy hiring practice is making sure the people that are on the team doing the hiring aren't burning out, but they have the opportunity to persist, that they have healthy boundaries around what they're doing, but they also have an impetus to keep moving forward. Um, the big thing here that I would say is we really don't want you to be a firefighter. And right now, in 2020 and 2021, and even creeping into 2022 now, it's really easy to operate like a firefighter. Oh, we have this person just left, or um, somebody quit out of nowhere, or Tom, we've had here at Summit, everybody's just having babies right now, so which is great. We celebrate that, but you don't want to be in a position where you're always putting out fires. Oh, I just got this notification and the whole place is going to burn down if I don't address this right now. So I've got to like clean off my plate, focus just on hiring because I have to fill this position immediately. And the reality is, you guys, the people on this call are, your gifting and your sweet spot is not putting out fires. Your sweet spot
Mhm.
is leading a team. Your sweet spot is investing in your company. Your sweet spot is uh, growing the other people on your team and uh, building your practice to where you want it to be. It's not, we don't want you to be in a position where you're constantly moving from urgent matter to urgent matter, from emergency to emergency.
Yeah, and as I hear
I,
you, Josh, saying build a sustainable practice, that makes so much sense if your hiring isn't that frequent, that you don't every time come up with a new process of let's ramp up how to get a job out there and where should we advertise it, and then have to go through an interview process. That's we don't usually do, and you just put so much extra sort of heat loss that happens when
mhm.
that and I hear what I hear you saying is that sustainable one is okay. If it happens, we know how to hire. We're continuing to do it, and it's a frequent thing that we're good at.
Yes, absolutely. And I would say it's really important to have some process documentation around this and to decide upfront what's important to us in this hiring process. How many rounds of interviews do we think it's going to take for us to get enough information out of this candidate to know if they'll be a good fit or not, both from a competency and a culture standpoint. You should decide who on your team is going to be doing each of those interviews, what your ideal timeline for those interviews to be is. But you're exactly right, Tom, that if you're not hiring very consistently, you end up just reinventing the wheel every time somebody leaves, or every time you have, you know, a couple more clients than you have capacity, and you're like, oh man, we've really got to bring in somebody. How did we hire somebody last time? I don't know. It's been 6 months since we brought somebody in.
Hmm.
Let's just throw something on Indeed, and we'll just sort through hundreds of applicants and we'll pay for all the leads that they had, and you end up spending all of this emotional energy, all this actual capital on buying leads or recruits or whatever that looks like, instead of having a practice that's tried and true that you can go to. And I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide, but the thing I want to add here that is really important for us to visit and sit with is that we've got to understand, particularly with millennials and with Gen Z, who are kind of these two, are college grads up to 40-ish. That group of people is understanding employment really differently than generations before them has. And if you're in this webinar, you know just as well as I do that people don't do 30 or 40-year careers in one place anymore. That practice is long gone. And I think the danger in hiring that we can face is we can have sort of a blind hope that people will do that with us. I know people don't do that generally, but they'll come into our firm and they'll love it so much that they'll just stay here forever. And we don't have to worry about them. And just assuming that we won't have to replace people because it'll be a perfect fit for them forever. And the reality is you could have a fantastic culture and competitive compensation and flexible work hours, and people can have great work friends, and sometimes their season of life just changes and this job is not going to make sense for them anymore. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a failure on your part. It could just be a change in what they need and what they're looking for. Now, I'll say if there's a pattern of people leaving who reference similar things, that's when you want to really do kind of an audit of your team and your processes and say, okay, we've got something going on here. But something when we think about hiring that's really important for us to engage in is that our employees, we really need to understand them as they're here for a season of their career, but they're probably not going to be here for the entirety of their career. And I don't mean season as, 1 quarter of the year. They're not just going to be here for the springtime. Hopefully that's not happening, except maybe with your college interns if you're bringing folks in for the summer. But really, we've got to understand that people are going to be with you, and especially in the accounting world, if you can hold on to your people for 3, 4, 5 years, that's a huge win. And it's just an industry where turnover is a normal part of life, and you guys feel that and you know that. But what I want to guard against is kind of our blind hopefulness that, well, it won't happen here. People won't leave here because they'll love it. And I really hope they do love it. And I hope that they can grow and have opportunities for advancement and fulfillment and for learning where they are. But we have to understand and build into our hiring practice that we're going to have natural turnover just because people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, they just don't want to stay in one place for a really long time. And that's going to continue to happen. We're seeing evidence that that's happening more and more with younger employees. And we've got to build a practice around preparing for that. So I've got a couple of phrases here on our next slide for building sustainable hiring practice. The first one is always be recruiting. Always be. I just kind of like the always be. I don't know why that really sticks with me, but
Sounds
it
like
does.
Always be closing as salespeople.
Yes,
Say, right?
exactly. That is exactly what it's from.
I love it.
So let the salespeople always be closing, but here in hiring, we're always going to be recruiting.
Yeah.
And I say that to say, if you're in a situation kind of like we mentioned before, where maybe you are only bringing somebody on every 6 months, that's the nature of where your firm is and kind of your growth rate or your turnover rate, that's totally fine. I would really encourage you to always be in a recruiting mentality. It doesn't need to be 20% of your week. It just needs to be a piece of your week, and a piece of your normal cadence is that, whether that's networking, through your LinkedIn network or through local associations, or even, if it's through like volunteer opportunities or alumni boards or anything like that, you've always want to have some feelers out for if there's talent out there, we have a place where they might fit. And staying in that sort of mentality is going to help prevent you from getting into the emergency situation where somebody gives you their 2 weeks because their uncle offered them a job for $50,000 more, and they're just going to disappear. And now we're panicking because we don't remember how we hired last time, and we've got to have somebody in here immediately to take over these clients. And we haven't been recruiting over the last 6 months because we thought Joe Schmo was going to stay here forever. But if we're in a practice of always recruiting and continuing to bring in candidates, or at least have warm touch points with those candidates, we're going to be set up for success when time comes to actually ramp up that hiring practice.
Josh, as I
Similarly,
think about
oh,
that, earlier this week, I heard a story that makes me think of this, and it was a firm, and it was a person who had left banking and was talking to the managing partner of the firm about maybe working there. And the managing partner talked to a few people and said, "Do we know what we would do with someone with a banking background?" And they all kind of scratched their heads and said, "Well, he's got a lot of contacts and he's got this and that," but everyone thought he was a really talented person. So they hired him and then commented on both getting that, but then when PPP hit, his knowledge of how the SBA and other banks work, they said, just became invaluable, and had huge expertise. But it
yeah.
felt like that kind of mindset where he didn't just turn it off and say, well, we're not hiring. He at least explored internally and said, might we have a place for this person?
Mhm.
And found a place for him. But then I totally get your point that if people are reaching out, and even if I'm not hiring today, keeping those things warm to say, I want to make sure I've got that network built in case something does come up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that bleeds into the second point really well, Tom. We always want to be engaging in some form of interviewing,
Mm,
some form of true touch point, whether it can slide towards informal or it could be a more formal interview process, but we always want to be engaging with talent in a meaningful and intentional way, kind of like this situation you're alluding to, Tom.
mm-hmm,
If you're in the practice of interviewing people and engaging with people, you could even discover a skill set or a talent in somebody that you weren't necessarily looking for, but you immediately know, I think this could bring value for us. And
mm-hmm,
may want to restructure part of the role that we're hiring for, or we might need to build out a new role that can really take advantage of this skill set this person has, because maybe I think they're going to be a fantastic culture fit, and they don't have exactly the skill set I was looking for call it a senior accountant position, but they do have that sort of banking that's going to bring some strategic vision and bring uh, maybe a fuller picture of parts of the banking world that we don't have on our team. Uh, and those skills can really, really grow our team, stretch the people who are here, continue to provide opportunities for our team to learn. Um, but we want to be
yeah,
in a practice of interviewing with people. And I'm really forward with people. There are people who apply with us when we're really not at a need for that position, but I'm still going to take the time to engage with them and interview with them. And I really believe that being clear is being kind with somebody. And I want to be, somebody on our team says that a lot. That's why
mm-hmm,
Tom and I are
yep,
kind of giggling. But
yeah,
I'm really transparent with our candidates. And I'll tell somebody, like, I think you would be a stellar fit for this position. I get really excited about the idea of you coming to join our team. We're not going to have a need to fill this role probably for 3 to 4 months, but I would love to stay in contact with you depending on what your job search situation is, especially in this environment right now. And we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but there are a lot of people who just know generally that it's a great job market right now. So they're kind of floating out applications and trying to see what's out there. And somebody who's fairly content in their role, but they're exploring new opportunities, is a great person to kind of warm up as a lead and keep in your pipeline to say, like, we've engaged with you. I know enough about you to know that you could do the job. I've determined that I think you want to do the job, and the people on my team also agree that you would be a fit for their team. So we're not ready to make an offer right now, or we don't have the space to hire right now. Uh, sometimes you make an exception for those people, and it
mm-hmm,
depends, of course, on your cash flow position and what that looks like at your firm. But that's a great person who I have somebody in mind in particular that I've been engaged with for some time right now, who's kind of communicated, like, my job right now is like totally fine. You know, it's providing for my family. I can see myself being here for another 4 or 5 years, but this isn't where I want to be in 10 years. And I'm trying to
mm-hmm.
chart that path out now. And we've started to engage with each other. And we've been having touch points over the last few months. But he's been a great person for me to have a kind of a warm lead with, because I took the interview with him even before I was ready to hire him, because he'd expressed interest and we developed a relationship, and that's gone really well. So we're now at a point where I'm able to kind of pull him forward in our interview process, move him along to meet with other people on our team, because we are in a position to bring him on.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of,
Great example.
oh,
No, I just like that example, and that makes a lot of
yeah,
sense to have that. That's a good way to say how to keep a lead warm.
yeah. Um, I'll say, I'll plug right here, guys. There are people on LinkedIn that I like. I know what their what their kids' accomplishments are lately and how their transitions have been, or how they made a move to another state. And there are people that it's just valuable to stay in connection with people. And
Mhm.
if you could take 3 minutes of your day to communicate to somebody else, I remember you, I remember this specific thing about you, and I'm curious
Mhm.
about how it's going. That one informs them what you would be like as a teammate, because you're not even in regular relationship with them and you've already communicated care, you've communicated interest in them. And two, that's every time you do that, that's going to kind of re-warm them up to the idea to being a part of your team, or at least pursuing their interest in your firm or the positions you have available. Um, Going off of warm leads and what that looks like,
Mhm.
the last always be is going to be always be looking for referrals. We love to encourage and incentivize people on our team to refer talent in. I know a lot of different firms do this different ways, whether they do, you know, some people do a mutual signing bonus for the referrer and the referee, or some people do a gift card once that candidate's been employed for 90 days or 6 months or whatever that looks like. But we love to do referrals because the first step in a referral is that that person already has some level of built-in trust, because they already had a relationship with their friend who sent them a text or shot them an email and said, hey, we've got a role here that I really think you could be a fit for. Would you want to talk about it? And those are my favorite sort of interviews to start, because I'm doing a phone screen, which is normally kind of the front door of the organization. But if I get in with somebody and they're like, yeah, I talked with my friend for an hour and a half last week, so I already know all this information about Summit.
Mhm.
I know a lot about the role. I've got some really role specific questions. I've got some company specific questions. That's that's always such a great place to start from, because it lets us have a really productive conversation. It lets us have a really earnest and honest conversation about fit, about what that person wants for their career, because they've already covered so many of the kind of the basics. And they're not just leaning on me, or they're not just leaning on the hiring team. Um, for better or worse, candidates are going to have some trepidation around trusting anybody who's in any form of recruiting role, whether it's a hiring manager or somebody in HR or people operations. Uh, there's always going to be a little bit of hesitancy, and that's not necessarily wrong, because we have to know when we're in a position to hire, we have to know internally we have a bias towards hiring because we have a need, and we're going to bring that bias to the interview, we're going to bring that bias to the process, and we have to work hard to keep that in check. We'll talk about that a little bit more to come, but a lot of times a candidate is going to sense that, and it can be it can take longer for them to warm up to you, to build trust with you. But if they've been brought in by a trusted friend, somebody that, we have people here who like, oh, we were in the same accounting program 10 years ago, and I sent her an email because I told her she'd be a great fit, and that person ended up starting with us and has had a great experience so far. But she already trusted her old friend, so much of the process was already done for her to know, like, whoa, I like my friend. I like the things that she likes. I tend to like some of the people that she likes too. And I'm going to trust that she wouldn't put me in harm's way. So when she's told me that she thinks I could be a great fit for this, um, that's always that's like a really sweet spot for a first interview with somebody who already knows, like, I think I like this. I think I want to do it. That's like music to my ears. So
This
always be
also sounds
recruiting.
like you're really making the pitch that it's not me always looking for referrals, but encouraging it within the company, right? That I've got this whole network, and so what am I doing to get other people aware of, whether you incent people or make sure everyone's aware of what we're looking for, things like that, that it's like the whole company is doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the idea is that, I'm going to trust that all of you've hired good people, and the
Hmm.
reality is good people are in good networks. So whether that's through their educational background, their career backgrounds, community organizations, like literally their neighborhood, if you have a workforce and a team that's bought in, they're high caliber employees who are really
Mm-hmm.
working together to push the ball down the field. Those people are also they're in networks that are completely disconnected from your company, and they've got access to literally hundreds of people that you don't have access to personally. So absolutely, I would reiterate that, Tom, that
Yeah.
I want to be looking for referrals too, and people that I knew from old organizations or various different groups, but I really want to encourage our team, because here at Summit, then I can multiply my effort 50-fold,
Yep.
and that makes my life a lot easier. And as a part of being a sustainable hiring practice, that really helps the whole burden of bringing in talent not be on my shoulders, but it helps me
Mm-hmm.
spread it among my team.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So are you ready for this one? And then I'll let people just kind of get familiar with the slide, and then I will launch the next polling question.
yeah, we're going to go to another polling question, but this is pretty counterintuitive in this job market, but it needs to be talked about. So I want to talk to you guys about filtering out disinterested job hoppers. And I say with all the compassion that I can muster, because I can empathize with this. You get somebody in the door who's qualified, who you believe they could do the job, and you really just want to push them through. Get them to the next interview, just get them to the point where you can make an offer. Because like I mentioned, when you have a vacancy or when you have a need, you're inherently going to have a bias towards hiring. And that's not wrong, because we have a job that we have to do. And this is part of the job, is filling this position. But we have to know that I'm going to have a bias towards hiring, and sometimes that can cloud my judgment when I'm trying to determine how interested a candidate is in me. And as counterintuitive as it may be, if you get candidates who are not actually interested but are qualified, you've got to let them go, and the sooner the better. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, and I've been a victim of this, I've kind of really believed in a candidate more than they believed in themselves, and I've advocated for them to our team, and we've ended up making a competitive offer. And Tom knows this. There's somebody that I made an offer to who accepted and then emailed me at 11 p.m. the day before their first day because they weren't going to come,
He did
and
so. Ouch.
did
Yeah.
not show up. And I had like sent coffee and donuts to his house and everything. And that was I took an L on that one for sure. But really what I want to dig into here with disinterested job hoppers, especially in this job market, people are really opportunistic, and that's not wrong at all. I think people should be opportunistic. This is a great time to evaluate what's my fit in my organization, what's my career trajectory here, what does my compensation look like, is it what I need it to be? And I encourage that. If people want to bring that internally to their leadership, that I think that's great. And I think it's natural that people in this sort of job market would be entertaining options that are outside of their current role. But what happens is you get somebody who just sprays their resume to 200 or 300 other jobs just because they're casually seeing what's out there. And you might find somebody who's really highly qualified, could definitely do the job, but you kind of get the sense that they're not that interested in it. What you can be tempted to do is move them along because you're super qualified. I think you could really do this job well, and you start to make excuses for them. I think one thing that I ask in every first interview is, what have you learned about Summit so far? And what have you learned about this job so far? With what you know, what makes you feel like you would be a good fit for this team? And I've had plenty of candidates turn that around and say, I don't know, what can you tell me about Summit? And that immediately tells me, like, if you didn't even Google us, I mean, you could have spent 90 seconds before coming to this interview to do just the briefest review of, what's our bread and butter? What is it that we do? What are a couple of things that set us apart from other companies? But if somebody's not done any of their homework, I know they're not seriously considering working here. Because if I'm seriously considering a career change and moving to a different company, you better believe I'm going to do my homework and I'm going to understand, what is it that they do? What's their differentiating factors? Does it seem like people enjoy their jobs there? Like, because we are having so many fewer candidates for each job position, it can be really tempting to move this person along because they're qualified and you think the hiring manager or whoever the next step in the process is going to give you the thumbs up and say, yeah, I think they can do it. That'll be great. But ultimately what happens is you end up wasting resources both in your time and your finances. You've wasted time on your calendar, on the hiring manager's calendar, anybody else who's on the hiring team, because ultimately this person they're not going to work out. Whether they accept an offer and they don't show up, or they get an offer, they come and they don't work out in your first 90 days, and then you're back to square one because you've had to release them and restart this search. Ultimately, you're better off cutting your losses when you realize that somebody's not actually interested in the position and moving on to the next candidate than kind of keeping that vice grip on this candidate who's maybe going to work out and you can kind of convince yourself. So I really want to encourage you guys, even though this market is really hard to find candidates who are qualified, who are a culture match, and who want the job, we can't compromise on those things, because if you do on any one of those things, it's ultimately going to cost you more. It's going to cause more pain and headache later, and it's going to cause a bottleneck in your process, both hiring and from client services, because of the transitions.
That's a really good point. And I think you're emphasizing that there's more dimensions to hiring someone than just qualifications and things, right? If they're not really interested in doing the role, or potentially the answer to that question, I didn't research you. Maybe they are really want to do it, but it might indicate they wouldn't be such a good teammate if they really don't prepare for things and do research. So it could be another outcome, but I really like that question that you asked, Josh, because it can get to, boy, on paper, you look like you'd be phenomenal. But if I'm just not seeing that kind of preparation, interest, things like that, why pursue something that, even to your point, maybe they do hire on, then they don't work out after that. Yeah, that's good. But it is, like you said, it's really tough. Your best friend that you said they don't want to end up getting the wrong house because they get so desperate. This could be a similar thing, right? I've got somebody who's qualified. I'll do anything to get them, but you're going to live with that decision.
Yes, absolutely. My best friend recently, they made an offer way over asking price on a house that had one less bedroom than they needed. And I was like, guys, don't do this. You shouldn't do it. And fortunately, they ended up not getting it because somebody paid even more for the house. But I had that sort of heartache for them. Like, I know you really want this to happen, but you don't want to settle, because ultimately you're going to end up paying for this. For them, they move into a 2-bedroom house and they want to start growing their family. So they're immediately going to have to start reconsidering and looking again. And for us, maybe we bring somebody in who we thought could really do the job, but they actually don't respect their trainer and they don't really listen to them or engage with the content that they're giving. They fall behind in their client work. They're not stepping into our standard processes, and we realize we're going to have to part ways because this is really not going to work out. So even though it's counterintuitive to cut people loose early on, if they're not a match, they're not a match, and they're not going to magically become a match 30, 60, or 90 days later. That's not to say there have been a handful of times when somebody in their first interview has not done their homework about Summit, and I've made the decision to move them forward. I'll communicate, I'll be really transparent that and I usually ask people, is it okay if I give you a little bit of professional feedback at the end of our interview? And people generally say yes. People want to know. If they're interviewing, they want to know. And I'm really transparent with people that, hey, the fact that you didn't do any homework or you didn't do any research on who we are communicated to me that you're not truly interested in this position. So based on the rest of our conversation, I'm wondering if you are interested in it, but I'd really like to see that you've done some research before we move you forward in the process. And I'm going to be there in that situation. I'll be there for their second round interview and see what sort of questions are they asking? Have they actually engaged with our content? But the feel of that interview is so radically different than somebody who comes in. And I had somebody I was interviewing earlier this week who referenced one of our podcast episodes that I had been on and something that I
Oh,
said personally. And I was like, wow, you did a deep dive. Okay, I am actually
yeah.
impressed by this. I don't want to say I'm really impressed by this, but
Yeah.
I am. But it told me like you're engaging both with who we are as a company, but also the content that we're putting out into the world.
Mhm.
You're seeking us out as a source to learn from and grow in your education. And that says a
That is
lot about
impressive.
your potential interest of being here.
Yeah.
Um,
And again, it probably shows how they might be as a team member, right? Because I would think of, okay, I put you on a new client. It feels like the chances of them doing research on that client is higher for how they researched us. And so wouldn't you love to have them in front of a client
Absolutely.
where they're saying, hey, I was reading this about you and learned this and this. I would think clients would love that. They want to think that you're thinking about them a lot. And that would
Yeah,
show that.
absolutely. I think a really simple way to say it is you're seeing if that person's proactive.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
generally across the board, I don't know any hiring manager who's like, I really want a reactive person. I want a person who's just sitting back and kind of waiting on life to happen to them. We really
Yeah.
do want somebody who's going to seek out and they're going to find the answers to their questions, or they're going to find somebody who can help them get the answers to those questions, or they're going
Mhm.
to do their work ahead of time. And that that does show you a lot about what sort of teammate they'll be, what sort of employee they'll be, and what sort of future they see for themselves. Are they somebody who really wants to contribute where they're planted?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great point.
Um, well, I want to move us along here and go through a couple of our now that we're working on filtering out the people who are not interested. But I do want to talk through a couple of interviewing best practices here. And I'll say this is going to vary based on your team, the makeup of your team, and who's involved in your hiring practice.
Mhm.
So really what I'll say is for us, what works well is to have an HR person or myself being in people operations assess culture pieces. So when I'm doing that first initial interview, we spend so much of our time on video calls with people. One piece is, what's your presentation like? How do you handle yourself on a call?
Mhm.
But I'm looking for cultural indicators like, are you a curious person? Do you feel comfortable asking questions or raising your hand when you don't know the answer or need help? Or do you seem like you are collaborative? It's another one of our really high values at Summit. Do you like working with a team? Are you seeking an environment where you can have sort of that mutual edification with your teammates, where you offer them expertise and they offer you expertise back, and you come together to create a better, tighter, more efficient process or find a better answer for your client? We also really value candor here at Summit. So is this somebody who's actually forthright about what they're thinking? Or do they strike me as somebody who's a person of integrity, who's really saying what they mean and they're not beating around the bush? Uh, but I really get to dig into that in my first call with somebody. And if there are red flags there, I I'm really inclined to go ahead and dismiss them from our interviewing process. If I really
Mhm.
get the sense that, uh, in our case, this person is a real lone ranger. Like they do not want to work with a team. They don't feel comfortable seeking out help from others, but they really have it's okay to be self-sufficient, but self-isolation is not going to work where we are. And if I can get a sense for that, and some people will kind of wear that as a badge of honor, but it tells me that this is a collaborative environment, and it's going to be really hard for you to mesh here if this is such a high value for you.
And Josh, as you mentioned that, and maybe this is more to accountants, those seem like questions that could be fairly challenging to come up with, right? So if you think of some of the values that you have as a company, asking someone, "Are you collaborative?" Is humor important to you? Things like that. That's hard to get an assessment of someone's answer because if they know it's a hiring question, they're going to say, "Yes, I am." And so I would
Yeah,
imagine putting some real thought into how do I see that, and curiosity as an example, since that's one of our core values. I do a lot of evaluation on the kind of questions the candidates ask us. Does it
hmm
feel like they're really being curious? And that seems like a good way to try to do that. But just those feel like harder ones than some of the more technical questions that are
yeah,
fairly easy to come up with. What's a good way to assess someone's technical skills?
yeah, absolutely. And I think something that's important here is we want to make sure whoever this person is, who's kind of the front door, the keeper of the keys, we
Hmm.
it's actually a lot better to try and assess the culture piece than it is to necessarily ask about a culture piece, because somebody can feed you the right answer, especially if they've done their homework and they've kind of read up on your website. So most people, if you ask, are you a very collaborative person, are going to finagle their way to say, like, I love working on a team. You know, in high school, I was always the one who pulled the weight in the team projects and things like that. And really, how I go about that is I'm trying to assess what that is as I'm asking them about their experience and about, you know, what's a previous hardship you've gone through, or what's a time you've had to deliver hard information to a client, or things like that. I'm looking for indicators of a culture match in their answers and in their past experience, as well as in the way that they speak with me. Like you said, Tom, the way they ask questions throughout the interview, or we always, at each stage in our process, we're always going to leave room at the end of an interview for a candidate to ask questions. And I really appreciated, we had a CFO candidate a couple of weeks ago, kind of towards the end of her final interview. We're like, do you have any questions? She's like, I feel like I've asked everybody so many questions so far. Like, I think I'm okay. And I had been in a couple of her interviews and I knew, like, yeah, you have done a good 30 minutes of question asking. So I understood that. Well, moving on here, why I think the second point is important is that while I love what I do, I love what I get to do, how I get to engage with our candidates, I am not an accountant. I have not been an accountant. I did well on the math part of my SAT, but I did not take accounting courses. It is just not, it's not my calling. So it's really important to me that we get somebody involved in the process early who's a subject matter expert, whether that's somebody who would be directly managing this candidate or somebody who would be working with their training, somebody who would be working alongside of them. I really need somebody who really knows the answers and knows the nuts and bolts of the role to ask specific, candid questions. And I could try and fake my way through asking about RevRecs or bank reconciliations or things like that, but ultimately I'd rather somebody who has the experience in that be able to ask those questions, because they'll be able to more accurately assess the answers that are provided. So I say that to say, don't let people stay in their lane and ask about what they're good at and where they have expertise. And somebody like myself, I'm quick to raise my hand and say, I can ask these questions and I can take notes, but I'm really not going to be a great person to assess somebody's competency in some of these specific accounting skills. Now, when it comes to their communication ability or their culture fit, things like that, I definitely can. But I want to make sure that whoever's assessing those skills also has those skills, because they can more accurately assess. We want to ask specific job-related questions. So scenario-based questions, like, let's say you get into a situation where you have 5 clients have all reached out to you and they all need something immediately. What do you do? What's the first step? Or you've just been asked to do a task and you have no clue where to start. What do you do? You find out that you need to deliver really hard information to an owner. How do you do that? And really let people kind of live out in front of you how they would operate. It tells you about their ability to think on their feet, their ability to stay composed under pressure. And it also, they get the opportunity to walk you through, like, this is what I would do, or this is a great place where candidates can say, oh, I've done this before. Let me tell you all about it. Like, I feel really comfortable in this process because I've had to break hard news before, and I always come in with a plan to execute afterwards. So they're not just left with the hard news, but they're left with a plan of, this is how we're going to fix it. And kind of this last point here that I already mentioned, always let your candidates ask you questions. I think a place where this gets fuzzy, what we don't want to do is, you don't want to have a 30-minute interview and take up 28 minutes of it just drilling somebody. And then kind of at the very end, you remember all of a sudden and say, oh yeah, did you have any questions? Because they're not in a position to, they know you're probably trying to get off the call. They feel guilty about going over their allotted time. So we really try to allocate a significant portion of our interviewing time to just letting people ask questions.
Mhm.
Usually in the earlier round, it's not quite as large of a portion of
Amount
our
of time.
time because
Mhm.
I'm asking a lot of questions about experience and resume and expectations. But when, let's say it's a senior accountant candidate, when they get in front of our senior accountant trainers, they should have a lot of questions for those people because they're people who've done the role before. They're people who are training the role right now. So they should have a lot of questions of what is my life going to be like? How are clients divvied up? What is the workload like? How do you spread out your week? Like, all these sorts of things. But we want to make sure to give them space to actually ask those questions. And it really says something. If you're doing a 30-minute interview, you go 15 minutes and then say, do you have any questions for us? And they're like, no, I feel good.
Mhm.
That's going to be a pretty strong indicator to you that that person's, they're not envisioning themselves in the role. If they have no questions for the people who've done the role before, that's going to be a red flag for us. And it would take something really exceptional or dramatic to be able to get past somebody who said, yeah, I don't really have any questions. Thanks so much for your time. We would really want to dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, should we continue on?
yeah, this is where I wanted to kind of land the plane here. I love this statistic about the value of having a diverse workplace. So you see there on the screen, companies that have more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue due to innovation. And we have this quote, increasing the diversity of leadership teams leads to more and better innovation and improved financial performance. You can see our kind of reference there at the bottom of the slide. But what I really want to speak to here for the people who are in this webinar, you're most likely going to have a tendency to hire people who are similar to you. That's how we're wired. That's a general tendency of all people, is we're attracted to things that are similar. And especially if you're an owner or a director, you're in management, it really makes sense, right? Because you've been a huge part of setting the culture of an organization. So it's kind of simpler to think like, well, I set the culture, so somebody who's similar to me is they're already gonna agree with what we do. They're gonna get along with how we do the processes, and they'll kind of fold nicely into what we're doing. The counter I want to present to that is you have blind spots. Every single person has blind spots. And if you've just recruited clones of yourself, or as some people would say, if you've just recruited a bunch of yes men or yes women, people who are just like, yes, absolutely, you're so smart and so great, and I don't disagree with you at all, you're really going to be lacking in your performance from an innovation standpoint, from an inclusivity standpoint. You're really going to be missing out on huge chunks of the talent pool who are really different from you, but have a really valuable perspective to round out your organization. So I say this to say we have to be aware that each of us brings to the table an unconscious bias. So there's a bias that we bring in hiring, that we want to hire somebody. So we have to know, I'm probably giving somebody the benefit of the doubt because I really want to fill this position. But there's also an unconscious bias that we bring to the table that and generally it's hard to reflect this way, but it's like, I like myself and I like people who are like me. And I have to know that my tendency is going to be to recruit and engage with and pass along people who are similar to me. And I need to actively step into how do I round out my team? How does my team become more well-rounded, both from a perspective of who could I bring into the hiring process with me to help with this? Maybe there's somebody on your team who's really different from you in the way that they think about things or the background that they bring to the table. And that's really excellent opportunity to bring that person into the process, because they're going to see things that you don't see. They're going to be looking for things that you're not looking for, and they're going to value things differently than you do. And with that cohesion, working together, you're going to end up getting a lot better candidate that's going to build a lot better team than if you just kind of get with your two best friends and all three of you think the same. You're going to be lacking in some of the value you see in candidates and the value that you end up getting out of candidates because of our propensity to hire people who are just like another one of us.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, on to the
I know
summary, and I will show the last polling question along with
yeah.
this one. I'll let people look at it quickly and then have you go ahead and go through it, Josh.
Yeah, so just to summarize and come back, we are we've been talking about how do we build a sustainable hiring practice, and what does that look like to make sure that us as the hiring professionals aren't burning out. We went through how to filter out disinterested job hoppers and how that's really counterintuitive right now when it's hard to find qualified candidates who are interested, but we've got to cut those people loose. The sooner the better, because otherwise we're going to waste resources on them over the subsequent weeks and months, and then be back to square one when they don't work out. We talked about best practices in interviewing and how to let people stay in their lane and kind of do what they're best at in the process. And we also engaged with the importance of hiring a diverse talent pool, the importance of having both diversity in the team that is hiring and diversity in the team that you're bringing into your organization, from backgrounds to thought process to how somebody envisions the role and the best way to do it. You're going to be a better team and a more effective team if you can bring more diverse voices to the table in that regard. So we've kind of finished up this polling question, and I know we're coming right up to time. So Tom, I wanted to make sure and see if we've got any questions that we want to jump into here before we wrap up.
We do. We have one about, do you recommend using recruiters? 55 on recruiters.
That's a great question. And I'll say there's nothing wrong with using recruiters. Recruiters are also, kind of like we've talked about, recruiters are going to have a really strong bias to pass along somebody to you that may or may not have the qualifications that you're looking for. Hopefully they do, that you've been really explicit about what you're looking for. But a recruiter is also going to be communicating with that candidate, and they're going to definitely have a glasses half full sort of mentality. So there's just some things to be aware of with a recruiter, that sometimes that candidate may or may not be interested in you because they've been connected with you through a recruiter, but they didn't find you on their own necessarily. But I will say, especially in a pinch or when you really need to add to your hiring capacity quickly, a recruiter is a great option, because it is financially, it's going to cost you to use a recruiter, but sometimes ultimately when you're running your business, it's worth your mental capacity just to bring on a recruiter to help you with that, so you're not taking on the full load yourself and ultimately burning out. So yeah. I would say generally, I don't have any hard yes or hard no on recruiters. They totally make sense in the right season, but I don't think I would stay in a practice of using recruiters always.
Okay, good. Thank you, Josh. Okay, a couple things to wrap up. If you want to keep learning, there is the Modern CPA Success Show that you can find on YouTube. So it is something that Summit CPA produces, and we have clients, employees, vendors, and others that are on there. So a great way to continue learning. If you want to be more connected, there's a CFO community. Many people from lots of different firms are in part of this community, and we have a pretty active group with people asking questions, sharing ideas. There's a marketing channel, and they actually do meetups, and there are different groups and channels that you can be part of that are in there. We do have a code that you can get 1 free month access if you'd like to try that out. If you want to get more extensive in virtual CFO work, there's a virtual CFO playbook. Pretty intensive course of 15 different modules, but it does include a free coaching session. The book that we have that's for free, you do get a subscription to that CFO community I mentioned, as well as weekly meetings and discounts on software tools. And finally, it's a hiring podcast, and we'll let you know that we are hiring. So if you looked at this and said, this sounds really interesting and the place where we work sounds interesting, please reach out to us. We are always be recruiting, Josh. So
always
this
be
is an
recruiting.
example of doing that. Josh, thank you very much. Yep. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day. And Josh, thank you again.
Absolutely.
Take care.